Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Gameweek 17 cheat sheet preview. Now this week, as we swing further ahead into these United and City swings, and we start to hit off a trough with, for example, the Chelsea swing, we're also looking at several teams who are about to hit new swings and probably will get a lot of dividends in the midfield and defender positions, especially as we move in out of the back four as an example, which a lot of people tend to be doing due to the ineffectiveness of Chelsea defenders, although I acknowledge that City still seem quite interesting during this run. We're also looking at potentially downgrading further forwards, or even looking across the pond from maybe moving away from Antonio, who still doesn't look interesting, even though the fixtures look very sweet for him, and other players such as Lukaku and Kane continue to not be options, and even Vardy has shown to be rested at times for this Leicester side. So if we look ahead to the defenders and start off with this week, we can see clearly that Ait Nouri is going to be that new option for this 3.9 to 4.4 range. He's 4.3 as a Wolves defender, and I think what's perfect about him is that we've seen Wolves do fantastically versus these big sides. Yes, they actually do tend to park the bus. We saw Pep, for example, be extremely critical of Wolves' performance with 10 men. But I think you have to expect that from a team that's lost their main striker in a game where they're facing probably the most lethal team in the league right now, besides Liverpool. And Wolves have done extremely well versus Liverpool and City. We've also seen them get lots of clean sheets consistently in the weeks before that. So I actually think that Wolves will 100% be a great option to look at, especially since those City and Liverpool fixtures have gone. And even though the fixture isn't as sweet as that green one that we anticipated and kind of enjoyed with players like Cody and Marcel earlier, Ait Nouri should be an option because he's already displaced Marcel in the team. Marcel has been fit for quite a while now, and he hasn't found his way back into the team. So I think this is a great opportunity for Ait Nouri to contribute, both in terms of open play as a fullback and someone who is a very, very cheap option, cheaper than someone like Cody, for example, playing for a very, very good defensive team. Ben Johnson falls, unfortunately, due to the injury situation. There is a chance that Masuaku kind of stays, but it really just depends on what happens to Cresswell and whether he actually recovers from his injury shortly. I don't expect him to be a consistent option, although Soufal can be a name that we can think about in the near future. If we look at 4.5 plus, I've actually added Ashley Young here. He's at 4.7 right now as a Aston Villa defender in FPL, but in real life he actually is playing as a winger. Now, Aston Villa have had tough games. We saw them play, for example, versus City and Liverpool, and they didn't do tremendously well in terms of creating chances in open play, and that's the one detriment, I think, with this Aston Villa side. Yes, they look organized. Yes, people are quite enamored by how much intensity they provide and how much press they're actually activating as a side, but in terms of open play, I haven't really been impressed by them yet. Most of their goals have still come from set pieces. And whilst they do have fantastic players such as Mings and Konsa who will be able to score in these kind of set piece opportunities, they have still been kind of scoring at a very, very extreme rate when we look at set pieces and compare them and contrast them to the rest of the league. So my concern with going for a player like Ashley Young is that they still haven't found necessarily any kind of attacking structures in open play for Aston Villa to be considered a top team. And that's kind of why I'm also a little bit scared of some of the other Aston Villa defenders, such as Cash and Target at this point in time. It might actually be preferable to stick with the centre-backs who are the more consistent scoring options and routes into the Aston Villa defence. As we look into the 4.9 to 5.2 players, Gabriel, who's someone who rises, I've been constantly talking about his ability to lead this Arsenal team from a physical presence point of view, and we've seen that offensively as well with how he scored multiple goals. Actually, there was one goal that was actually disallowed in that game, so he possibly could have scored two set piece goals this week, just like the Aston Villa defenders that I've been talking about. And Gabriel interests me because whilst yes, Arsenal's defensive numbers are overall quite poor, I actually think that there's a huge drop off between this Arsenal versus when they face, let's say, mid-table teams and bottom half teams compared to when they face the top four. I think most of their chances given away have been to these teams like Chelsea and City and Liverpool, where they've had markedly very poor performances, and that should skew the stats and how they look for Arsenal. However, when I've seen them play versus these kind of bottom half and mid-table teams, I actually think that they've been quite consistent in terms of closing down high impact chances, which is why I am tempted to have an Arsenal defender during this run, especially if you don't have Ramsdale as your keeper. As someone who owns De Gea, Gabriel is definitely an option. I know some people would also be looking at Tierney, who's kind of at this price range, but his injury concerns and those kind of issues will always be ever present in my mind, and defenders are usually a position you don't really want to change too often unless something significantly changes with the structure or the template of your team. But Gabriel for me remains a fantastic option. In terms of the last change for the defense, I would actually say that the only change here has been to move Rudiger to the 6+ range because he's clearly deserved to be pushed up there. Alonso is the only Chelsea defender who I would consider really getting in my team who's below 6. Alonso doesn't tempt me that much, whereas James unfortunately does not either and therefore has to fall. I think Rudiger has been interesting these games. Not only, I wouldn't say he's been lucky to us. When you actually look at the games, yes, he earned 2 penalties, which you don't expect for a centre-back. But you can actually see that when Chelsea are struggling in these games, that their go-to plan late in the games is like many kind of tactical plans for managers who are desperate for results in the last 10 to 15, 20 minutes of the game, where they will send, let's say, a centre-back forward and try to get a goal by playing the centre-back as an additional centre-forward. We've seen that time and time again from, for example, teams like Real Madrid and Barcelona, who used to send Piqué and Ramos forward at many times to get goals and actually contribute late into the game, acting as a centre-forward and being another kind of pivot option to make sure that they, or a decoy at least, or actually able to score from a set-piece chance or an open play chance where they actually hold off a defender, as an example. And whilst Alonso and James have still been in very active positions in open play, we know this Chelsea side have had much less possession, really not enjoying their time without Kovacic and Kante on the field, and Jorginho still is nursing this sort of back injury. However, we are probably going to see Kovacic coming back into the side soon. We're also probably going to see Kante back into the training soon. I think Tuchel said that Tuesday would be too early for him. But it does kind of tell me that keeping at least one Chelsea defender during this fixture period is good, because I still see these Chelsea defenders being long-term holders. I know Rudiger owners would definitely like to keep him. I mean, he's been contributing in so many various ways, and we saw that in the United game as well, where he could have scored in the dying stages of the game. And that kind of once again points out that really one of these Chelsea defenders will always contribute, at least from a defensive point of view. And yes, whilst James, for example, has earned 0 points in 3 weeks back-to-back, I still think that fixtures will roll around. It's not like James is a poor player. We know that when they actually have the structure in place, and they will very, very soon, that this Chelsea side will turn around, even though their fixtures aren't perfect. You know, they are very much going to face City and Liverpool soon, which will be tough matches, but that's pretty much how I view the Chelsea defense. Definitely players to keep, and not necessarily problems at this point in time for our teams. If we move on to the midfield, we actually have a lot of movements in the kind of budget price ranges, and the reason why is because with a lot of people going to Ronaldo last week, you now have players who are more invested in these kind of 6.4 and below midfielders, especially since they're moving out of players like Rafinha. We saw Gallagher have a fantastic week, and I'll start with talking about Gallagher, but clearly there is going to be a dichotomy between two different types of FPL players. People who have invested into 5 midfielders, who have heavily invested into, let's say, someone like a Mount and a Bernardo at this point in time, and maybe even gone for a 5th defender, or midfielder rather, such as a Bowen or a Foden. But we also see these teams where they're playing a 3-4-3, for example, going with something like a Ronaldo, Dennis/King, and Antonio or Watkins front line, which means that they're looking for players at these price ranges. And I think it's clear to see that with Smith Rowe coming back and hopefully getting rested enough, and Aubameyang no longer being an interesting option, Smith Rowe still ranks there, I think, quite well as a very interesting attacker. We've seen him do well, and the fixtures are still there for Arsenal. Whereas with Gallagher, the big reason why he was dropped in recent weeks was because of the fact that he played defensive mid 2 games back-to-back due to the MacArthur injury. I thought Hughes slotted in very well last night when they were playing versus Everton, and we once again saw Gallagher playing a much more advanced position, which means that he once again is going to be a fantastic option. The next 4 games are actually quite appetizing. We have Tottenham on the radar, which is one toughish game if they actually get their players back, but we know that they'll be struggling due to training injuries, not being able to train, and then players also recovering from COVID, which will probably be quite a difficult kind of situation and circumstance to navigate for this Tottenham side. Meanwhile, we get to see, for example, Crystal Palace face Southampton and many other weaker teams at this point in time, which I really fancy Gallagher for. I'm actually probably looking at Gallagher as my main target this week to kind of fully disclose things with you guys. With Odegaard, I think he's been exceptionally in form. He was someone that I definitely said that he kind of slipped off of my radar, because the thing with Arteta is that he likes to usually play the same structure and just change players based on their form, and clearly Odegaard is the player in form. I can see Odegaard retaining his spot in the team and contributing in these very nice fixtures, and we've seen him score a wide variety of goals, some cutback goals such as the United goal, a header actually last week, which is quite a surprise as well. And Martinelli alongside him has propped up as a differential. We've seen him take set pieces, which is a really nice thing for Arsenal. I would say Gabriel is really the only key option there on the set pieces, but Martinelli has also shown quite a lot of stuff in open play that excites us as potential owners, and he is at that kind of price where you can clearly say that he's an enabler in your team. If you're, for example, one of those players who are going for, let's say, a 3-4-3 that I talked about, where you have Ronaldo and he is holding a lot of price in your team, then Martinelli could potentially be an enabler that gets you a Man City midfielder to at least pair yourself off if you are worried about, let's say, missing out on Man City midfielders at this point in time. So that's pretty much why I think it's worth maybe casting your eyes towards these players if you don't have enough money to actually spend in the midfield at this point in time. Maddison gets a rise. However, I will say that there is a bit of contention with whether he's actually allowed to play versus Tottenham because of the continuously developing situation at this Tottenham camp. We saw today one positive COVID test and then an outbreak in the under-23 squad, which will actually once again hamper this Tottenham player list. And if they're not able to continuously field out a starting selection, we could very well see this game versus Leicester be postponed. And that's going to be a big point of concern for Maddison owners this week. He did actually get a price rise yesterday, but I still think that he's been in exceptional form. So is Tielemans, to be quite honest, who actually returned from injury with a bang. But Maddison has looked exceptional in open play. I wouldn't say the underlying stats are there, but we know last week that Grass FC did indeed win momentarily versus Analytics FC. But Maddison has been quite interesting, at least from an expected assist point of view. So we can clearly see that he is playing a very creative role for this Leicester team. Whether they actually get as many good games as, getting to face a very terrible side such as this Newcastle team is another question. But we have definitely the potential for Maddison to do well, especially with a kind of injury-ridden Tottenham side. Tielemans also remains as a differential at this point in time. Him taking penalties is interesting, but we know that Vardy will probably play the subsequent game, and you can't guarantee yourself with, let's say, someone who's more of a box-to-box mid at this point in time. So I have to keep him as a differential, even though he clearly has an X factor and is a fantastic player to watch. Just not necessarily someone I'd like to get in terms of getting short-term explosive rewards in FPL, since the Leicester fixtures do actually get turned for the worse very, very rapidly. So for me, Maddison is kind of like a short stopgap in your team where maybe he could explode with his kind of fantastic form as of late, and you can move him out very quickly, whereas Tielemans is someone who probably will get more asymmetric hauls compared to the easiness of fixtures. Tielemans is an X factor, as I mentioned, and we can see, for example, outside the box goals in tougher games, as opposed to him, let's say, contributing week to week versus weaker teams like he did versus Newcastle. Mount is someone who rises in the 6.9 to 7.7 category. The reason for this is simply, as I said, he is the talisman for this Chelsea side, and whilst the Chelsea fixtures are going for the worse very, very shortly, Mount has proven himself to be clearly a fantastic option, especially since other players like Lukaku and Werner are, looking to be benched week on week by Tuchel, and Mount seems to have basically established the starting spot. The one worry, of course, is, let's say, if he hit maybe one bad game, we could see Tuchel have the will to actually bench Mount, but I really don't see that being as an option, since he's basically their best attacking player at this point in time in open play. So for me, Mount remains as a great option, and especially for those players who are deeply invested into the midfield, Mount is a very, very easy lock. Gundogan actually falls. If you were listening to the Pep Guardiola press conferences, he did mention that Gundogan is basically nursing what seems to be a back injury, very much similar to Jorginho, and he thinks that has somewhat affected the way that Gundogan has been playing and his form at this point in time. And if you are a Gundogan owner, although I don't really usually advise side grades, I think this is the time to do so. If he is nursing a back injury, we could see him being rested into several more games, and maybe due to the fact that he is overtrained or the injury has somewhat inflamed itself, we could see a clear move to Bernardo Silva and Foden being the key options that you have available as a Gundogan owner. At the 8.0 range, I would love to add Sterling, 8.0 plus range, sorry, I'd love to add Sterling into this kind of list. Sterling has been in great form. He also took the penalty kick versus Wolves, which is a very, very positive sign because we know they don't have a designated penalty taker. And if you look at, let's say, the key stat for me with Man City midfielders, it's actually minutes played. And if you look at the last 5 matches in a row, he's played consistently around at least 85 plus minutes a game, and that clearly shows that Pep has had the confidence in him. And what we know from Pep is that he's very consistent with players who are performing well, and he rewards form greatly with a lot of minutes played, and that's exactly what has happened to Sterling so far, even though he is at quite a premium price. If you don't have Ronaldo, though, I'm sure, and you don't have Son, for example, he clearly is that kind of money that you probably want to spend in your team alongside, let's say, another Man City midfielder if you've decided to not go for a premium striker structure. If you're tired of Vardy as well and you want to move into the midfield, he's clearly another player at that Vardy price who is exceptionally interesting. And I think during this kind of run of games where Man City will continuously torture these teams, if you look at the expected goals in the last 2 weeks, I mean, it's been over 3, which is actually extremely high. I think still higher than what Liverpool has been posting lately. You'll know that they're creating plenty of chances where Sterling will 100% be involved. And from that point of view, I can see Sterling getting much more consistent holds on a week-to-week basis, which justifies his price, in my opinion. And alongside, let's say, another Man City midfielder paired in your team, I think he could be a devastating option to have for a lot of 5 midfielder owners. Sancho and Rashford fall. I just wasn't interested whatsoever in Man United in open play. I saw a lot of missed touches, a lot of terrible ball carries, a lot of very poor passing in the final third with this United side. And as a Ronaldo owner myself, there are some question marks as to whether he really holds that value for money. As I just mentioned with Sterling, he's playing with the creative side who have a fantastic fixture swing themselves. They are actually creating chances versus these weaker teams. Whereas with United, we just saw them play versus Norwich, who, of course, although while they look somewhat revamped under Dean Smith, they still weren't able to create consistent chances. And Sancho and Rashford and even Fernandes, to a larger extent, have not been interesting whatsoever, which kind of colors this category as well with the 11.9 plus, where I've fallen Bruno. And KDB just still doesn't appear as an option in FPL at this point in time, just due to whatever is really going on with his injury concerns and how Pep kind of navigates that situation. Going into the forwards, there's been, once again, a lot of movement. Not much movement around the kind of Dennis King / Pookie Broja territory. I know a lot of people think that Dennis has 100% won outright versus King. I would still say that King has had several contributions this season. I don't think you're necessarily comparing purely analytics versus on-field performance. You know, King has contributed at least quite a lot in open play this season. So for me, King is still an okay option to have. Probably Dennis might be the winner of this debate if you were someone who watched the highlights of the game. But if you actually watched the game overall, King was still contributing several chances. He could have had maybe 2 chances to score, one off the post and one where he didn't exactly wrap his leg around the potential assist from Dennis, and Dennis was able to score off of a corner set piece. Dennis actually did play centre forward, and I think that is the biggest argument to say why Dennis might be the more interesting option going forward, although I think it was specifically a tactical adjustment by Ranieri against this Brentford team, who really like to play with this right centre-back almost as a deep-lying right wing-back that allows, Sergi Canos to push forward. But we'll see exactly what happens there. I think King will probably move back to centre forward this week, although that could be wishful thinking as a King owner myself. Dennis probably is the priority there in this price range, and the issue with players around this tier is that, once again, although Norwich did look quite good versus United, I still think that they're not creating enough chances as a team, and the quality of the team is overall quite poor, which is why Pookie still remains as a differential. And then with Broja, his injury clearly means that there's going to be question marks over him, especially since Southampton have continuously dropped in form, although he still tempts me as an option so long as he's fit. Tony has fallen as well. It's partly due to the COVID situation, but partly due to the fact that Brentford will have worse fixtures going forward. We've kind of gone over this run, and Mbeumo has been the one who has benefited in the last 2 weeks as Tony has missed from COVID. And as Tony owners, I think some people might be interested in keeping him for a little while longer because he doesn't necessarily seem to be a huge problem in the team. But from as someone who has been a Tony owner during this period, I just wasn't interested in him in open play at all. And I feel like holding on to a player for penalties is sometimes a little bit of wishful thinking. I think there are just more interesting options if you actually move out of the forwards altogether. Let's say moving Tony to a 4.5 or moving Tony at least to someone like Dennis or King so that you can actually upgrade your midfield or defense if that's something you'd like to do. With Armstrong, he has suffered an injury, so he falls, so nothing too significant there. And Wilson falling is also partly due to Newcastle's fixtures being horrendous. And I really struggle to see how Newcastle will continue to build chances versus some of the top teams in the league. And they will definitely struggle until we hit this January transfer window, which might be wishful thinking as well, because their season has gone so poorly at this point in time. Even though he still is the talisman, I just think you can't expect much from Newcastle now, and they clearly probably are the worst team in the league from just watching them play, and Wilson falls as a result of that. Vardy falls, and that's largely due to rotation and the fact that it seems like Rodgers is dedicated to giving him rest between game weeks as he needs it at his kind of age and at this time of year. So for me, whilst Daka could be an option, I just think it's not worth it. You're basically juggling between Vardy and Daka each week. Vardy is someone who probably you want to move out of your team post the Tottenham game if that game actually goes through whatsoever. And if it gets suspended, it's a perfect time to move out of Vardy if it's worth a -4. And that could easily kind of move you back into this very midfield top-heavy structure that probably will work out better for you in the long run. Ronaldo is the one player around this price range who rises. Contrasting that to Kane and Lukaku, who just either one hasn't been able to play or one has been coming off the bench and just not looking that interesting. Once again, still not being able to gel with this team from a goal scoring perspective and being able to kind of create alongside some of his Chelsea partners. Lukaku just hasn't been exceptional. Ronaldo is someone who didn't look great versus Norwich, but we know he still is the talisman for the system. If you watch back the United game and look at where the chances have fallen, most of them really came towards Ronaldo. He maybe could have scored at least 3 goals in that match if he was maybe in better form. The intensity was not there, I think, from the attackers nor the defenders for this United side. I think the best players right now, ironically, are still Fred and McTominay. So we'll see what happens going forward. But Ronaldo still seems an okay option to hold. I don't think he's a big issue unless the Man United COVID rumors turn for the worse and things change and Ronaldo is someone you might have to move out once again. But I think clearly the move is to move out Ronaldo into at least a Watkins if, let's say, the United news is bad, or some other players such as Dennis or King, which allows you to once again beef up your midfield, which is basically, for me, the state of play at this point in time. You could go for a back four, but that still, once again, allows you to go for midfielders because the top midfielders are still around 10.7 in price. That extra 1.5 million that you actually get compared to, let's say, Ronaldo or 1.7 million will easily allow you to play a back four while comfortably playing a midfield 5 at any point in time. So that, in my opinion, is a nice kind of balance in terms of budgeting when you actually have a deep midfield. Instead of actually having to force yourself to play 3 defenders back to back, you could actually have a very stable, strong starting back four week to week with, let's say, the 4/5th defender being rotated constantly, or that being a City player such as Walker. In terms of the keepers, there has been no movements whatsoever. I've actually completely scrapped the 6+ territory right now for keepers because I really think that as we approach this kind of fixture schedule where I imagine a lot of teams will drop clean sheets, and what we've seen and how the points have borne out this season is that clearly players like Rudiger, who are at a 6.1 price, have just outperformed their kind of comrade in terms of Mendy and their kind of teammate. So there is no real value to holding a Liverpool asset as well. Alisson is probably one of the top performing 6+ keepers, but we can see that someone like Van Dijk is going to get more points over the course of the season. So there just really isn't any utility there. I think if you were looking for money to kind of dispose into your team, and it has to be by taking away the 6+ goalkeepers and moving that into the midfield at this point in time. De Gea and Ramsdale for me are the top keepers in the game, with Ramsdale being slightly better. Even though De Gea clearly has the fixtures, I think that United have actually been letting a lot of good chances go through. Whereas with Arsenal, even though Ramsdale had to make a lot of saves for Southampton, if you look back at the understat kind of XG versus Southampton, Southampton only had an XG of 0.5, and they allowed Ramsdale to get at least 3 save points that game, which tells you how many poor chances were actually created by Southampton and how many easy saves Ramsdale had to make. Contrast that to De Gea, who had to make a lot of tough saves and had a man-of-the-match performance versus Norwich. I think De Gea might be able to salvage a few more games, but I still think the Arsenal defense is actually a little bit better than this United side. But we'll see what happens as the fixtures get a little bit tougher for Arsenal and the United fixtures remain relatively green. With Salah, I actually think he's still a great option. It's just that the fixtures were tough. I actually expect this Wolves team to actually get a lot of clean sheets in the near future, which is why I mentioned Ait-Nouri is a great option as a differential for the defenders. But we'll see what happens there. And with Lloris, clearly there's just an issue with the Tottenham game. I'd probably put 3 asterisks on him just because I don't know what's going to happen with the Leicester game. But probably not someone I'd actually like to spend my money into. That's it for now for this week's cheat sheet. I hope you guys have a wonderful game week going forwards and hopefully a green arrow.